Donald Trump has been misled into believing that it's an external tax. The tariffs are paid by producers outside the United States, not the consumers inside the United States. I mean, it's the most simple Econ 101 that I guess everybody in his administration flunked. Before money can be money, it has to be a commodity. Bitcoin skipped the commodity and tried to go right to the money. Gold is valuable because it's a metal that we need and use. And the reason it's money is because I don't have to use my gold today. Maybe we would have been better off if we made George Washington the king and if we were still ruled by his prodigy, because maybe we'd have a lot more economic freedom.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director here at the IEA. And before we go any further, I'm just going to remind you to subscribe to this channel and to subscribe to our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined on the podcast by Peter Schiff, the economist, financial commentator and investor who rose to prominence before and around the financial crisis of 2007-8 when he predicted the impending housing market collapse and financial crisis that ensued. Peter is the CEO of Euro-Pacific Capital. He's the founder of Schiff Gold, and he hosts the Peter Schiff podcast. Today, we're going to talk about his economic views, his background in Austrian economics, his view on where America's economy is heading, and how, if it's possible, we can radically restructure government and return to sound money principles. Well, Peter, welcome to the IEA podcast. We're really delighted to have you here, and I know a lot of our viewers and listeners will be familiar with you and some of the things you've said and done over the years. But I wonder if we can start with a pretty basic question, and that is, how would you describe your own economic and philosophical views?
Well, I'm a very free market, Austrian School economist, very much a believer in the principles upon which the United States was originally founded. Republican government, meaning, not one man, one vote, majority rules, but a government that is run, on behalf of the people, but not based on the majority will of the people, that you have the minority protected by a constitution and you have a government of checks and balances, so that government stays small. I want government to be as small as possible so that we have a maximum amount of individual freedom and liberty. The government should mainly be there to secure those liberties. It's not there to redistribute wealth. It's not there to provide us with things. It's there to protect our rights. And we don't have a right to the productivity of our neighbors. We have a right to our own productivity and nothing else. And I think if we all interact with one another in a free market, then everybody will be better off. You have Adam Smith's invisible hand and all of the other benefits that attribute to a market-based economy. And I believe to the extent that people fall through the cracks, it should be handled through private charity, not through coercion and government force.
Well, brilliant, Peter. I mean, I think we've quickly established there that you are, in fact, our kind of economist. So, I mean, I guess I always like to know, how do people arrive at their views? What was your journey to this viewpoint? You studied finance at UC Berkeley. I'm guessing you didn't pick up these concepts there.
No, I really didn't pay much attention to any of the economics at Berkeley. They're a bunch of socialists, Keynesians, whatever you want to call them. But no, I mean, my father pretty much set me on the right path from an early age and gave me books to read from Austrian economists, and Ayn Rand novels, and taught me about sound money and gold and the Constitution, and so I never really had to make a journey back to these principles. A lot of people, they grow up and they become very idealistically, socialistic. I don't like to really use the word liberal because they're not classic liberals. They're more fascists. But a lot of people have to discover these principles later in life. They have to, deprogram themselves from being brainwashed into public schools. But no, I went into the public schools already educated by my father, so it didn't work on me. So I was able to stay level-headed which I think is why I can evaluate things, so objectively now. And I always see the unintended consequence of every government uh, proposal or program. I can immediately see, how it's not going to work and why it's not going to work, and what these unintended consequences are that are going to result in achieving the opposite of the stated intent of the legislation. And so it just happens like second nature.
Yeah. So you really came to prominence, I think, certainly in the US and to a degree in the UK as well, around the time of the financial crisis, or really just before the financial crisis, when you were one of the people predicting a housing market collapse and a financial crisis following that. Um, and I'm kind of curious to look back now. Obviously, that was a huge moment in economics with a lot of fallout over the subsequent decade and a half. But when you look back now with everything you've learned, how do you tell the story of how the financial crisis happened? Because this wasn't, I think we'll probably agree, even if no one else does, of the inherent failings of capitalism.
Yeah, no, it was a failure of government, not capitalism. And yeah, because I understand the consequences of government policy, I warned for years that the artificially low interest rates of the Greenspan Fed, together with the moral hazard of not just the FDIC, but Fannie and Freddie securitizing mortgages and buying subprime mortgages, I could see that we had a huge housing bubble that was unsustainable. But I also saw how the housing wealth was impacting the economy, and how people were consuming more and saving less, and the whole economy was distorted based on the illusion of wealth that didn't really exist. And I knew that there was a lot of fraud inherent in the mortgage market and the housing market based on the government's involvement, and that I knew that eventually uh, rates would rise, teaser rates would reset, housing prices would crash, and it would bring down the banks that financed it. And I knew that Fannie and Freddie would go bankrupt, and I warned about all this. The problem was I warned about it for several years before it actually happened, and I was so concerned about it that I wrote my first book, which initially was going to be purely about the housing market and the crash that was coming. And I eventually condensed that into a chapter, but I called the book Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse. And that book came out in February of '07. And then we had the financial crisis in summer of '08. And the book actually sold more copies after the financial crisis than before it took place. It was like the only book that was on the shelves at the time that was like predicting anything bad. And so it got a second lease. Um, but what was frustrating is, they had a commission in Congress to try to find out why there was a financial crisis, and I really tried to get called to testify, but they didn't want me there. They only wanted people who were blindsided by the financial crisis to testify as to why it happened. And the main reason was all the people that the government brought on to explain why we had a financial crisis, and of course they had no idea that it was coming until after the fact. They all blamed a lack of regulation,
Yeah.
right? Too much greed on Wall Street, right? Not enough capitalism. My blame was the government itself. Like when George Bush made a speech early on, he said Wall Street got drunk, right? That was his and I said, yeah, they were drunk, but where'd they get the liquor, right? They got it from the Fed, right? So you can't just look at what Wall Street did as a consequence of Fed policy. The Fed policy inflated that bubble, and government policy insured mortgages that never would have been written but for government insurance. And so the whole thing was a failure of government. And so my prescription, had they called me to testify, would have been to get the government out of the housing market completely. Not just, put Fannie and Freddie into receivership, but get rid of them so that people don't buy houses because the government guaranteed their mortgage. We want people buying houses who can actually afford them. We want banks to lend based on the credit worthiness of the borrower, not the government cosigner. And we want housing prices to reflect reality. We want people to have to put up 20% down, not zero down or whatever, 3% they got now. I wanted a real free market in housing where housing prices came down, right? The government wants to make housing affordable by making the mortgages cheap. I want housing to be affordable because the house itself is cheaper. I don't want people to have to borrow all this money to overpay for a house. Let's build houses at a price that Americans can afford, and so they don't have to go so deep into debt. And I really would like to see the government get out of the deposit guarantee business. I would like banks to have to compete for customers based on the credit quality of the institution, based on the fact that they're not doing crazy things with your deposits. But when the government guarantees the bank deposit, it introduces a horrible moral hazard where no one cares how much risk the banks take. As a result, the entire system is insolvent today. And they just pretend that it's not. But the stress test that they ask the banks to run never tests for stagflation. That's the one economic environment that they've never been asked to stress test, and that's where we are. And so that's why I think all these banks are going to fail. They're probably going to be bailed out again. We would have been better off. And I advocated back then. Not only was I against all the bailouts, I wanted the banks that did get drunk on the Fed's liquor to suffer the consequences, because not all the banks did that. There were plenty of banks that didn't drink it, and they would have survived. But you had a lot of these big banks that should have failed. They weren't too big to fail. They because they were big, they needed to fail. And we needed sounder bankers to come in and pick up the pieces. Instead, we bailed out the bad actors. We enriched them and rewarded them and created yet another moral hazard. And so now all the banks that we bailed out because they were too big to fail, well, they're way bigger now
Yeah.
than they would have been had we let them fail.
So, I mean, clearly this problem hasn't gone away, right? I mean, I think that there was sort of a division of thinking, even among free marketeers after the financial crisis, where some people thought, well, look, what's been exposed here are some fundamental flaws in our economic model, or at least in the way that our economic model is governed, regulation, central banking, and everything else. Other people who thought this was primarily just a kind of technical failing of regulation or of monetary policy decisions, and with a few tweaks, things could get back to normal. So, I mean, I think that we've gone with that latter view, right? We've done the tweaks, and maybe a lot of people would argue, since the financial crisis, we haven't allowed. I mean, I guess your views are really rooted in Austrian business cycle theory, right?
I think at this point, it's not a theory anymore. It's been proven so many times that it's basically a fact. How the Austrian School explains the business cycle. And not only did I predict the 2008 financial crisis years before it happened in the exact way that it happened, but I also predicted what the government would do in response before they even realized that they would have something to respond to. And unfortunately, I was right again. They did exactly what I warned they would do, which was a mistake, which was lower interest rates again, zero, quantitative easing, print a bunch of money, reflate the bubbles. The only thing I got wrong, really, was in my assessment of what would happen after the government made that mistake. I assumed that the attempts to reflate the bubbles would fail, and that instead we would have a big drop in the dollar and a surge in inflation. And that didn't happen. And we went on many, many years, and the bubbles got so much bigger. And not just real estate, stocks, bonds, cryptocurrencies. I mean, we inflated just this massive bubble, and the debt rose to enormous levels, way beyond anything that brought us down in 2008. And the fact that we were able to kick the can down the road up until now, and we're still kicking it, just means that the crisis that's coming is going to be so much worse than the one that we had in '08, because we didn't get to solve the problems. We covered them up and made them all worse. And now I think it's not going to be a financial crisis. We're going to have a dollar and sovereign debt crisis. And it's going to be far more, economically destructive to the standard of living of Americans than what happened in '08. And there will be no bailouts. And I think, that process may have already begun. I mean, this week is one of the worst weeks for the dollar that I can remember, as far as how much value it's lost relative to other currencies. Gold is just hanging out just below $3,000 an ounce, ready to just explode to multiples of this price. I think the dollar is very close to really losing its cherished status as their primary reserve currency. And, there's a big misconception out there, in the Trump administration about our role in the global economy. um, they seem to believe that the world's been taking advantage of us, that the world has been living off of our economy, and they have it backwards. We've been taking advantage of the world. We've been living off the productivity of the rest of the world. We run trillion-dollar a year trade deficits. This is propping up our service sector economy. We've outsourced all the hard work, all the production. And how do we pay for all the goods that the world produces? We just create money out of thin air. And so we get the benefit of their productivity, of their land, labor, and capital that they've devoted to producing goods for us at the expense of producing for themselves. And all we do is print money. We borrow money, but we don't save money. We have this artificially inflated standard of living that's made possible by these trade deficits and the debt. But of course, we are selling off the cows to buy milk. The world is accumulating assets as we buy their stuff. So there is a day of reckoning coming, but I think we're accelerating that process. The tariffs might really highlight it. Donald Trump has been misled into believing that it's an external tax, that the tariffs are paid by the producers outside the United States, not the consumers inside the United States. I mean, it's the most simple Econ 101 that I guess everybody in his administration flunked if they don't realize that there are consumption taxes on Americans. And, it's funny, they don't even see the inconsistency because they say that, oh, no, the tariffs aren't going to raise prices. Our trading partners are just going to pay them and eat it. But at the same time, they expect the tariffs to result in domestic manufacturing coming back. But the only way that the tariffs would result in U.S. manufacturing is if they succeed in raising prices high enough to make U.S. manufacturing competitive again. And I don't even think 25% will move the needle. I think if you have a 25% tariff, we're just going to pay 25% higher prices because that's not going to be enough to get a factory here and a supply chain and the infrastructure. But even if we get import prices high enough so that we can now be competitive, how long is it going to take to build out what we need? Where's the money going to come from, the capital to do it? I mean, what are we not going to do so we can build out these factories? And who the hell is going to invest the money necessary to do all this when it may take years and years to actually, get into production and the tariffs could be gone, in which case you've wasted all your money. So, this is completely farcical.
Yeah. I mean, you said there that you felt Trump had been misled into thinking that tariffs were paid by other countries, not a tax on domestic consumers. Is there an implication there that you have some hope for some aspects of the Trump government? Are there things that his administration is doing that you kind of think have promise?
Well, look, cutting waste, fraud, and abuse is great. It's long overdue. Of course, you're never going to get rid of all the waste, fraud, and abuse. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast when it comes to government. You can't have a government that is efficient. Efficiency is only found in the free market. If I own a business, I will be efficient because if I'm not, I'm wasting my own money. And so I have a lot of incentives not to waste my money. Plus, if I have competition and my competitors are efficient and I'm being wasteful, then they're going to undercut me and I'm going to go out of business. So you have market forces and self-interest that keep you from wasting resources. But when you're in government and you're spending somebody else's money, who cares? And you're not going to go out of business. You have no competition. So there's no incentives to be efficient. In fact, the incentives are to spend as much as possible because then you get rewarded with a bigger budget. You got more staff, you got more power. And of course, when it comes to fraud, it's so much easier to defraud the government than it is to defraud a private person. I mean, the government is so vast. I mean, you can steal from the government. They don't even know. But if someone tries to steal my money, I'm going to know, and I'm going to try to stop it. So that's good. But I don't like, Trump refuses to, um, um, you know, do anything about entitlements. No cuts to Social Security. In fact, we're not even going to tax Social Security benefits, which is like increasing the benefits. He wants to cut taxes on tips and overtime, which is a pure Keynesian stimulus that's just going to be spent, more demand, higher prices. It's not going to lead to economic growth. It's not like growth-oriented tax cuts. It's a Keynesian stimulus, increasing military spending. The big, beautiful budget that he wants to come out of Congress is big, but it's ugly, right? It increases the deficit. So he's not really doing that. I mean, he talks the talk. I really love the end of his State of the Union speech about restoring American freedom and liberty. And I mean, yeah, he talks in many cases like a libertarian, but he's not. And the worst thing about it is this, he's been completely hijacked by the cryptocurrency industry. I mean, this is a farce that, his administration now pumps and dumps crypto, and everybody is trading on insider information and making a fortune off of this. Meanwhile, he wants to make America great again, but he wants us to be the leaders in crypto. Why would we want to be the leaders in a digital Ponzi scheme or digital pyramid? I mean, whatever money we waste on the crypto industry is money we can't invest in actually in productive investments, in real wealth creation. If we're going to try to wean ourselves off of depending on imports, we need to produce real things, not tokens, not virtual tokens that have no value.
So, Peter, I was going to come to this later, but I think you've brought us to the topic straight away, so let's jump in. You may not know this, the IEA was the organization that published Hayek's The Denationalization of Money in 1976, which was really a call for competing private monies, competing private currencies, and the idea that consumers and indeed kind of macroeconomic stability would be better served by a competitive system than one that was overseen by government. Some people would see crypto as a kind of modern flourishing of that idea, or at least the early stages of it. You, on the other hand, you're a real crypto skeptic. We already got that in your last remarks. But can you explain to me why? Why is crypto not something that we as free marketeers should be pretty happy about?
Well, I have no problem with a free market in monetary alternatives. I'm all in favor of that. In fact, I would like to get the government out of the money business entirely. I mean, I think we were better off before the Federal Reserve than after. And, because it didn't take the Federal Reserve long to really start, blowing bubbles. I mean, look what they did in the 1920s. They were created in 1913. But, when we started this country in 1789, and I think that the Coinage Act, the first Coinage Act, I think was 1791, but we defined the dollar basically by a weight of gold or silver. But the price of gold was $20 an ounce. And when we created the Federal Reserve in 1913, it was still $20 an ounce. So the dollar maintained its value very well for 120, 130 years. The general price level was cut in half over that period of time. So people enjoyed not just stable prices, but consistently falling prices, which led to a rise in the standard of living. It wasn't until we turned over the function to the Fed, and at least initially, the Federal Reserve notes were fully redeemable in gold. They needed 40% gold and 100% per commercial paper just to issue the notes. And the original Federal Reserve Act forbade the Federal Reserve from owning any U.S. Treasuries. Not only couldn't they buy them, which they still can't do directly, but they couldn't even own them on the balance sheet. But over time, that was changed. And I think we would be much better off without a Fed. And in fact, one of the reasons for the Fed at the time, we don't really need it anymore because, there were so many independent banknotes that were circulating, all backed by gold and silver. But the idea was, hey, if I'm in California and somebody tries to pay me with a banknote from New Jersey, how do I know it's any good? I mean, it's so far away. I mean, what if it's not a real bank? And so they thought, hey, if we had the Federal Reserve rediscounting all that commercial paper, we can all just negotiate Federal Reserve notes that everybody would recognize. But I think today with the communication and technology that we have today, it's very easy to verify somebody else's note. And especially if you want to use blockchain or the internet, the original banknotes were redeemable in gold. Well, who's to say that banks or other institutions can't issue a cryptocurrency that's redeemable in gold? They could circulate as money even better than paper notes did. So, yeah, I would love to get the government out of money. I would love to have competition for money. If some people want to try to use Bitcoin, have at it. I think Bitcoin is lousy money because, A, it's very volatile and very expensive and very slow. So if you actually wanted to transact business in Bitcoin, it would be very difficult. Whereas if you tokenize gold and put it on a blockchain, it's quick and cheap. And in fact, you don't even need a blockchain because you can centralize the custodian who can handle the books and records, but it can all be done instantaneously at a low cost. But the other reason that Bitcoin doesn't work as money is because it can never be a store of value because it doesn't have any value that it can store. Um, my definition, or the best definition of money, is the most liquid commodity. So before money can be money, it has to be a commodity. Bitcoin skipped the commodity and tried to go right to the money. Gold is valuable because it's a metal that we need and use. And the reason it's money is because I don't have to use my gold today because gold doesn't rot or decay or tarnish. Gold, I can bury it in the ground and dig it up in 1,000 years, and it's exactly the same. I mean, I can leave it on the bottom of the ocean for 1,000 years. None of the elements are going to harm it. And so I can store that value for eternity. And so that makes it ideal money because I don't have to spend it. We can hold on to it and it can be used in the future. But Bitcoin doesn't have any of the qualities that make gold a valuable commodity. It has some of the qualities that make gold better money than other commodities: portability, divisibility, durability, all these things. And that's what Bitcoin copied. But it doesn't have the most important part, that is the value of the metal. Why gold is valuable. I mean, the Bitcoin community likes to pretend that gold has no value at all, that it's just worthless, that it's just, it's just some kind of mythical thing that we just believe in it. But that's Bitcoin. They're describing Bitcoin, which is all based on confidence. Gold is based on the value of the metal. It doesn't matter whether I want to have confidence in it or not. The reality is it's a great metal that does all sorts of things that other metals can't. And people have been using it for thousands and thousands of years, not only as money, but as a metal. But yeah, I mean, I think if we had a pure free market, Bitcoin would lose. One of the biggest problems now is the government prevents competition. I think the main reason that we don't have a bunch of gold-backed cryptocurrencies circulating right now is because of the laws, the KYC, AML, all that crap. The government makes it so expensive. The government doesn't want you using alternatives to their fiat monopolies, which is kind of ironic that they're now embracing Bitcoin. But again, that's all because the politicians who are embracing it have been bought and paid for by the industry. And talk about ultimate rent seeking, and that's what's going on here. But yeah, I think that if the government stayed neutral, if there was no Bitcoin reserve, if the government was not trying to stack the deck in favor of crypto now, I just think that it would fail. I think people would lose their money. The Ponzi would collapse, or the pyramid, and that would be that. But yeah, I don't want the government to say that people can't use Bitcoin if they want, or any of these shit coins, whatever, fine. But what I don't like is the fraud. I mean, I'm against big government, but I'm not for anarchy. So I do think there should be laws. Most of them should be on the local level, not on the federal level. But I think it should be a crime to defraud people, to get people to do something that if you told them the truth, they wouldn't do it. And I think that's what's happening all in crypto, where people are being misled and people play into their ignorance and greed to try to pump and dump these coins on them. And so I don't think I think there should be some consequences to that. I think there should be, the court should be able to address this. But to the extent that, people are just willingly gambling and greedy, and they're just, caveat emptor, I mean, you lose your money, learn a lesson from that and try not to be as foolish the next time.
So I guess it's inherent in your economic view of the world that we need a massive shift in monetary policy. I mean, you've already spoken there basically about returning to some kind of gold standard, maybe with competing private currencies on top of that. And one of the views that I've always kind of agreed with is the one that if you could wave a magic wand and bring back the classical gold standard, which existed probably from like the 1870s to around the time of the First World War, you would. But it's very
Oh,
difficult in the
absolutely.
absence of magic. I mean, would you accept there's a scenario in which it's just not possible to get back to a commodity base? And if that were the
So
case, what would be your
it
second
is
best option?
it is possible. It's just that politically, it's not really feasible because the politicians don't want to give up that control. The reason they don't like the gold standard is the same reason that high school seniors don't want a chaperone at the prom, right? They want to do things that the chaperone won't approve of. Well, gold keeps politicians honest. It prevents them from buying votes by creating inflation. They can't create money unless they have gold, and they also can't try to micromanage the economy. They can't try to like fine tune it with the way they adjust interest rates and money supply. It puts them in a straitjacket, and that's great, right? But if you're one of these people who believes that central government planning is what works, and we can't have the free market setting interest rates, we have to, assign that job to a handful of people who decide what interest rates should be behind closed doors. If you really believe that the government is omniscient and knows more than all of the people acting in their self-interest in a free market, if you're really a socialist, then you don't like the gold standard. But if you're a free market capitalist, Austrian economists, you want the gold standard. So we could go back, but it's not. There's going to be consequences, right? People are going to lose money. I mean, we have to devalue the dollar and find a price of gold that would work. The official value is like $42. I don't know what it needs to be to get all the currency out there to be backed by the gold we got in Fort Knox. We'll see what we got, but we'd have to figure out where we can fix gold to the dollar now, right? But then we have to immediately balance the budget. Okay, well, we have to cut massive government spending. So we could do it, and interest rates would be a lot higher than they are now, and that would mean that there'd be a lot of defaults and bankruptcies. Okay, we need to do that, including the government. The government would have to admit that it can't service the debt, and it certainly can't repay it. So we'd have to restructure Treasury debt. I mean, yeah, it's like a national bankruptcy, but there's a lot of light at the end of this tunnel. I mean, we can emerge, a very sound nation. And, capitalism worked great in the 19th century. It'll work better in the 21st century. We got better technology now than we had then. So if we have the level of freedom in the 21st century that we had in the 19th century, we will have an even bigger economic boom, especially if you look at what we're doing now with artificial intelligence and the prospect to dramatically increase the productivity of humans, or in many cases, create humans out of thin air. I mean, labor is a scarce resource, but with AI, we may have an unlimited supply of it. Intelligent labor that can do work. So, there's a lot of things to be optimistic about. But we just got to restructure the economy so that the free market can make the most of it. And we got to get the government out of the way. But it's very difficult to do that. They're making a lot of headway down in Argentina. We're not really making it here yet because I don't think things have gotten bad enough for there to be enough political will to swallow the bitter tasting medicine. That's why Donald Trump just promised, an immediate boom, a golden era. We can't have that unless we go through the pain, right? I mean, if we're going to get rid of the drugs in our system, we're going to rehab first. And, that's not like Club Med. So we're going to have to pay the piper. And, when you hear some of the people in the Trump administration, when they're trying to, tout their tariffs, and they're saying, hey, in the 19th century, when we had a great economy and the Industrial Revolution, everything was really great, we ran on tariffs. And they're trying to claim that we had a great economy because of tariffs, and tariffs are great, and that's why we had a great economy. What they don't understand is the reason that we only had tariffs, and we had a few other, we taxed liquor, we taxed, a few things, firearms, we had taxes. But the reason that we could function on tariffs was because the government was tiny. We hardly had any government to pay for. And so since government was so small, yeah, some tariffs were enough. The reason the economy was great was not because of the tariffs. It was because the government was so small, we could pay for it with tariffs. So it's small government that caused the economic boom of the 19th century. And if we want another boom, it's not going to be produced by tariffs. It's going to be produced by massively shrinking the government. We don't want the tax. If we want the tax system of the 19th century, we need the government of the 19th century, which means 90% of it needs to be eliminated. And that includes, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and all this stuff that they've taken off the table. We got to make dramatic reductions in those unconstitutional programs.
So do you think there's an orderly way to achieve all of that? If you had a government with the right kind of ideas and they wanted to come in and they wanted to do this in a sort of controlled way, is it possible? Is there a way out? 'Cause, I mean, the picture you paint is a pretty dire one, that we're in a massive debt-fueled bubble. And it kind of sounds like, in a way, the only way out is bankruptcy and restructuring. Could this be done in a different way, or does it have to get really bad before anything
But
changes the way you want to see it change?
well, their solution is just to inflate away the debts.
Mm.
Rather than acknowledge that we're broke and we can't pay, let's just create inflation to make it easier to pay because we're paying the debt with cheaper money. But I think that is a worse way to default. And I think you run the risk of it running away from you and you have hyperinflation. And so the worst possible outcome is that we just wipe out the value of the dollar completely. And then, of course, that's worse than just restructuring your debt because now your debt's worthless. Your Social Security benefits are worthless. Your government pensions are worthless, right? So I'd rather cut those programs so that the benefits that we do pay as we phase them out still have some value to the people who really need it. Instead, if we end up with hyperinflation, you know, the people who really need the benefits get nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess the thing is, and I know that the charge your critics would throw at you is that you thought that this inflation was coming kind of post 2008 through the 2010s, and it didn't emerge. And I remember right after the financial crisis, there was a real flourishing of interest among free market types in Austrian business cycle theory, in these quite radical ideas about restructuring the way economic policy works and everything. And then I think because that inflation that was predicted never emerged, a lot of free market people have kind of shifted back towards more mainstream views, if you like. And so people talk a lot of
Yeah.
monetarism, nominal GDP targeting, that kind of thing. Is your view that, in a sense, you were always right, but the timing was wrong and it's taking longer than you expected for things to come to fruition? Or is there something you didn't perceive post 2008
Well,
that
first of all,
explains why
I
the
think,
inflation didn't take off sooner?
yeah, I don't think it's that the inflation didn't happen. I just think it wasn't recognized, and for a number of reasons. One is the way we've decided we're going to measure the effect inflation has on prices. Because remember, inflation is the expansion of the money supply. That is literally what it is. Prices just rise as a result of inflation, but sometimes they could fall. It's just that without the inflation, they would have fallen more. So if inflation prevents prices from falling, it's still doing harm, right? You're still being robbed of purchasing power you otherwise would have had. But the way we have decided to measure the effect of inflation through the CPI is deliberately designed to understate the degree to which prices are going up. So I think one of the reasons that we didn't see the inflation is because the way we measured it was flawed. It was there, but it didn't show up in the indexes. So when the government was claiming, oh, inflation is 1.5%, it was probably 3 or 4%. So we had higher inflation than what the government was admitting to. And that was borne out by all sorts of other studies, or just anybody with an eye to look at what's happening to prices. They were able to see it. In fact, I remember in 2013, I did a video where I looked back over the past 10 years at the price of newspapers and magazines because I happened to check at the time. And according to the CPI, over those 10 years, newspaper and magazine prices rose by 30%. Well, I just said, well, let me see. I went back on the internet and I took like the top 20 magazines and newspapers, and I went and I saw images of them from 2003, and I looked at the prices that were written on the magazine covers of the newspaper, and I compared them to the prices that were on today, and the actual increase was 130%, not 30%. So it's like, what happened to the extra 100%? I mean, it went into the CPI, but it never came out, right? So there's all kinds of machinations with hedonics and substitution and stuff like that. So it's really a bad measure. So number one, we were being lied to about the inflation. But also, the way a lot of the inflation entered the system via the QE mechanism was through the financial markets. So the prices that were most impacted initially were asset prices. So inflation was pushing up stock prices, real estate prices, bond prices, more so than consumer prices. So I knew, though, that it would only be a matter of time before the inflation moved out of the financial sector to the real economy. So from Wall Street to Main Street. And that process was finally really accelerated in 2020 when we flooded the economy with money, not just through the banking system, but we mailed out stimulus checks and PPP checks, and we just like flooded the economy with paper money. At the same time, we told the people not to work, stay at home, don't go to work, don't produce, just keep shopping, right? So it was an inflationary cocktail that finally blew up. And I think the inflation that we had in 2021, 2022 was actually a lot higher. Again, the CPI peaked out at 9%, but that probably means we're at 18%. You probably have to double whatever the CPI is to find out what's happening. But now, I mean, all the inflationary chickens have come home to roost. We're getting it. The lag was a lot longer than maybe I would have thought. But now we're in an inflationary cycle that's going to keep getting worse and worse and worse, especially if the dollar goes down. And, if you remember, too, the whole nonsense about a 2% inflation target, the Fed didn't invent that target until this core PCE was below 2%. They were getting core PCE of like 1.5, and they said, oh, we need 2. And that was to justify printing more money, keeping rates at zero. But they never really had a 2% target. They just made that up when it was convenient because they were below it. And where they got it from was in New Zealand, they had a 2% ceiling. It was never a target. It was a ceiling. Just don't let inflation get above that ceiling. But there was never a central bank that said if inflation is 1, you need it to go up to 2. The Fed invented that, and then the ECB did the same thing, and then the Bank of Japan. And everybody said we need 2% inflation, and then they lied to us about what the inflation rate was, so it would still look like it was below 2% to justify their 0% interest rates or negative interest rates or asset purchase programs. But now, right, all that inflation that they deliberately created is here. And they're not going to put the genie back in the bottle in Europe. They're not going to put it in Japan. They got 4% CPI year over year in Japan, and they're still at 50 basis points interest rates. So inflation is now, a worldwide thing. And, when they try to say, hey, Biden's policies didn't cause inflation or our Fed policies didn't cause inflation because they had inflation all over the world, it's because the whole world was following our playbook. They all made the same mistakes. All the central bankers created inflation. They kept interest rates artificially low. And so all the major developed economies are now having to lie in the bed they made. That's why we all have it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that strikes me in this conversation, actually. It's kind of funny because, I spend a lot of time talking to people about why is the British economy underperforming the US so badly? And I think this is probably the case in most parts of the world. You look at the US and you think, well, here is the one economy which still seems pretty dynamic. It's producing world-beating companies, new technologies, and so on and so forth. So probably for a lot of us who are free market or libertarian, not in the US, we look across the Atlantic and we think, well, we'd like to be more like those guys. Do you think we're wrong to have that optimism about America, or do you think, looking the other way, we're just even worse?
Well, here's the thing. The whole world can't do what we do because what we do is run huge trade deficits. Well, that means somebody has to run the surpluses. Every nation can't have a trade deficit. Somebody has to have a surplus. We have a phony service sector economy. If the whole world tried to emulate that, then there'd be no goods to consume. Also, we just borrow tremendous amounts of money. Well, somebody's saving that money or we couldn't borrow it. I mean, so everybody can't do what we're doing, but we basically got, the long stick and the draw, they got the short stick. We are in this position because we have the reserve currency where we benefit from every crisis, because every time there's a problem in the world lends us more money and we can just spend it. And that spending is our GDP. But if you look at the debt, we've accumulated a lot more debt than we've grown our GDP. So the whole thing is a gigantic bubble that is unsustainable. So yes, if you just look at how much money we're all spending, and you look at the value of our assets, the paper, the stock market, the paper wealth, hey, America is doing great, but it's just one big bubble. I mean, that's the same thing, the argument I was making about the housing bubble. People used to say in 2004 and 2005, when I was pointing out all the mortgage debt, they said, yeah, but you're overlooking all the home equity. I mean, people have so much equity. And I kept saying, yeah, but what happens when housing prices fall? The equity's gone, but the debt's still there. And then the interest payments go up when the teaser rates reset. But people just didn't understand that. They thought that housing wealth was permanent, even though it was just a function of the last house and what price it was sold for. So the American economy is being overrated as far as people thinking that it's so great. If it was so great, we'd be running trade surpluses, not trade deficits, right? We wouldn't be the world's biggest debtor nation. We'd be the world's biggest creditor nation, right? So we're bleeding red ink for a reason. It's not because we've got this great economy. It's because we've got this great bubble.
Yeah, I wonder if you can just talk me through this trade deficit, trade surplus point a little bit more, because I mean, I get what you're saying, but it might strike some people as a little bit odd to hear you as a free marketeer, as a free trader who's criticized protectionism on this podcast and throughout your career. Normally, when people complain about trade deficits, it's because they don't really like free trade, because they're kind of economic nationalists, because they have some kind of a very different view of free trade from your one. So what is your critique, in simple terms, of the US's trade deficit? Why is that a problem in a way that, say, for the UK, I would say us running a trade deficit really isn't that big a deal. That's just
Well,
sort of inherent to our situation.
the only time you can run, I think, a trade deficit is if you still have a current account surplus. So let's say that a nation has a lot of income coming from their foreign investments. They could use that income to pay for their imports. And so the trade deficits are sustainable. Trade surpluses, back in the 1980s or 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, we were the world's wealthiest creditor nation up until sometime in the late 80s, I think, before we flipped over into a debtor nation. And now we owe more money than all the other debtor nations of the world combined. And if you kind of look at America's position in the world, we don't have anything in common with the other leading industrial economies. We look like the banana republics, as far as our net creditor debtor position. So, I think that we have to look at what is wrong with the economy and why is it that we are accumulating these deficits. And it's because of the uncompetitive nature of the economy based on excessive regulation and taxation and an absence of saving based on artificially low interest rates and excess consumption, but also because of the massively mispriced and overvalued US dollar. So we've created a situation where foreigners are trading us their goods to earn our dollars. See, normally the exporting is a means to an ends. It's not an ends in and of itself. It's like if somebody has a job, in most cases, they don't want the job. They want the money so that they can pay their rent and buy food and take a vacation. So the job is a means to get what they want. Exporting is a means to pay for your imports, right? If some other country produces something more efficiently than you do, and you want to take advantage of that, how do you pay for it? Well, we're going to make something that they can't, and then we're going to trade, and we're going to gain from trade. So you export to pay for your imports. Well, if we're running these huge deficits, why are all these countries exporting stuff to us if we can't give them anything in return? It's because we're giving them dollars in return. Now, the dollars are really nothing. We create them out of thin air, but the world just values them for whatever reason. They believe that they're valuable. They're a safe haven. They could use the dollars to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of bilateral trade in dollars. There's a lot of debt and money being borrowed in dollars. So there's a role. And then you can use those dollars if there's a mystique about the American economy. You can use those dollars to buy U.S. stocks, to buy U.S. real estate, to buy U.S. bonds. So that's what's enabling these deficits is people are accepting our dollars. But when the dollar really tanks and people no longer want our dollars because they no longer want our financial assets, they don't want our bonds because they recognize how severe inflation is going to destroy the value, then the whole system implodes. And then we're left with an economy that doesn't work because we can no longer live off the overvalued dollar and its reserve currency status. Now, if we want to consume, we have to produce. If we want to import goods, we have to export goods. And the economy is just not capable of doing that right now.
One final question, Peter. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Let's say you find yourself in charge just for a day. You can make one big, lasting, permanent change. What's it going to be?
I don't know what I could do in a day. Guess you've been an algorithm. I don't know. But what I've been saying Trump should do, and what I would do if I was president, is just refuse to sign the increase in the debt ceiling. The Democrats Republicans rather, are proposing a $4 trillion increase in the debt ceiling. If I were Trump, I would say, over my dead body, I am not going to sign an increase in the debt ceiling at all. The buck stops here. We have 7 trillion in debt. It's not going to grow by 1 penny under my presidency. You want more debt, then you override my veto. You need 2/3 of the House and Senate to increase that debt ceiling. And if there's enough people that stand by the president, then Congress is forced to slash spending right now, not come up with a plan that supposedly does it years in the future and never happens, but accelerate the crisis to right now and then force Congress to make the difficult choices and deal with the consequences. So that would be something that can be practically done. But, depending on, what I could do, about, abolishing the Fed, or doing something to return to sound money. There's a lot of, laws and regulations I'd like to repeal. I don't know if I could do it by executive order. Maybe I could just, if I had ultimate power for that day, maybe I could just make myself king or something, and then I would get to stay there. In many cases, a monarchy would be better than what we got now. I mean, the framers didn't want a monarchy. Maybe we would have been better off if we made George Washington the king, and if we were still ruled by his prodigy, because maybe we'd have a lot more economic freedom than what we have right now.
But as long as they were like him, the apple may have rolled far from the tree. You never know.
Yeah.
All right, Peter, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right.
It's been a fantastic conversation, and I hope we'll have you back sometime.